Chapter 1 Review. We covered a lot of new skills in this chapter. Let's take a look at them. Alright, lesson 1.1, we talked about finding the value of digits and what those different digits mean. Now we have to remember place value when we're finding the value of digits. So if we take a look at number 1, our 9 is in the tens place. Our 9 is worth 90. Oops. It's an ugly 9. Our 9 is worth 90. Okay, number 2, our 1 here that's underlined is in the 10,000s place, and our 1 is worth 10,000. Number 3, our 3 is in the hundreds place, and it's worth 300. And number 4, our 9 is in the 100,000s place, and it's worth 900,000. Now, the biggest mistake that I've seen you guys make is you have rounded instead of found the value for these types of problems. You need to make sure that you're reading the problem carefully, and when it says find the value or what is the value of a certain digit, make sure you are finding the value and that you're not rounding. Okay? Alright, let's go on to the next one. Now we also talked about comparing values. In this case, we're comparing values for two different numbers. We talked about when we went over this lesson the fact that we need to think about what the value of those different digits are. So in 46,359, the value of that 4 is 40,000. And in 14,906, the value of this 4 is 4,000. Okay? Now we're going to put the larger value of the 4 first. In this case, it is our larger number, but that's not always the case. So we have the 40,000, the digit with the 4 in the 10,000s place is going to go first. So the value of the 4 in 46,395 is blank times the value of the 4 in our second number, which is 14,906. Now remember, they were talking about the value of that 4. So if we have 4,000, and we're going to multiply is times, which means we're going to have to multiply it times something to equal 40,000. Now we have to think, okay, we're adding 1 0 to the end of this, which means we're multiplying times 10. So the value of the 4 here, which is 40,000, is 10 times the value of the 4 here, which is 4,000. Okay? All right. Next, we talked about rounding. Now, rounding was tricky for some of you. We want to make sure that we're not only looking at the underlined digit, but that we're looking at its neighbor as well. We talked about the rule that if it's 4 or less, we ignore it. And if it's 5 or more, we add 1 more. Now, we're always talking about the neighbor. In this case, here is our neighbor. It's a 4. Over here, here's a neighbor. It's a 3. This neighbor is 5. And this neighbor is 8. So, when we're using these rules, we're talking about the neighbor number. We're not talking about the underlined digit. We're talking about its neighbor. Now, so we look at number 1. Its neighbor is a 4. That means it's 4 or less. We're going to ignore it. The 2 and the 8 stay the same. And our 6 stays the same because I'm ignoring that 4, which is its neighbor. So the hundreds place, my tens place, and my ones place both turn to zeros. What I need to think in my head is 286,476 closer to 286,000 or 287,000? My thousands place is what's going to be changing. It's either going to stay at that 6 or it's going to go up to that 7. Okay? Let's take a look at the next one. Again, we're looking in our thousands place, so we have to look at its neighbor in the hundreds place. And we're going to use the same rule. 4 or less we're going to ignore, and 5 or more we add 1 more. So its neighbor is a 3, which falls into the 4 or less category. So we're going to ignore it, which means it's going to turn to a 0. And our 9 that's underlined is going to stay the same. Our 2 and our 8 also stay the same. And the rest turns to zeros. Okay. Our next one, we're looking at our 5, and that is in the underlined digit is in the 10,000s place, but we have to look at its neighbor, which is a 5. The 5 falls into this category, 5 or more. We're going to add 1 more. Now, we're not going to add 1 more to the 5. We are going to add 1 more to our underlined digit. So our 4 is going to turn into a 5. What we have to think is this number, 245,001, closer to 240,000 or 250,000? In this case, it's closer to 250,000. We know this. We know that we're going to change that 4 to a 5, or we're going to round up, which is what it's called, because its neighbor is a 5. Okay? And last problem where we're rounding. We're looking at our 100,000ths place to round to, so we look at our neighbor, which is an 8. An 8 falls into that 5 or more category, so we're going to add one more to our 100,000ths place. What we need to think is this number closer to 100,000 or 200,000? When we look at it and we see that its neighbor is an 8, we know that it's closer to 200,000. Okay? Be careful when you're rounding. Always use these rules on the neighbor, not the underlined digit. Alright, now renaming numbers was also tricky. Renaming numbers was tricky because we had to think about our numbers differently. When we're renaming numbers like this, we have 82,000s. We talked about when we have these names that sometimes it's easier when we cross out that S and then we read it again. And this we would read as 82,000. And we know what that is, 82,000. We could also look at our 2, and our 2 needs to be in the thousands place. Okay? Let's look at number 2. We have something 10,000s. Or we could cross that S out again and we have blank 10,000s. 10,000. Okay, well, what would be what 10,000? So let's underline the 10,000s place. And then we're going to put a box around this. Everything to the left of the 10,000s place and the 10,000s place itself. Okay? So when we would say this, if we said it this way, which would sound a little funny, but we could say this is 60 10,000s. That's a way to rename it. We could also call this 600,000s, but in this case they're asking us for how many 10,000s, and there are 60 10,000s. Next one, we're looking at our hundreds. We want to know how many hundreds. So we underline the hundreds place, and then we're going to put a box around our hundreds place and everything to the left of it. And here we have 92 hundreds, because we know that 1,000 is equal to 10 hundreds. And in this place we have 9,000s, which means that's equal to 90 hundreds. And then we add the other 2. And this last one, all it wants us to do is write the number. So we have our 8 in our 10,000s place. We don't have any thousands. We have a 4 in the hundreds place, and that is all. Okay, be careful when you're renaming numbers. Think about what they're asking you for. Alrighty, then we move to addition and subtraction. Addition and subtraction, you all know how to add and subtract, but it does get tricky when we're subtracting among zeros and when we're estimating. Now, because both of these numbers are in the 100,000s place, I can round them to the 100,000s place. If one of them was, let's say this 5 was not here, and we had 92,000 here, well, we can't round one of them to the 100,000s place and the other to the 10,000s place. So we have to make a decision. Usually it's better when you round to the smallest place, the greatest place value of the smallest digit. So in this one, we would round to the 10,000s place here, and we'd also round to the 10,000s place here. But because we do have 2 numbers in the 100,000s place, we're just going to go ahead and round to the 100,000s place. We have 800,000 here. And in this case, its neighbor is a 9, which means we're going to add one more to our 5. Our 5 is going to become a 6. Everything else is going to turn to 0. And we are subtracting. So when we subtract, we always start with the ones place. 8 minus 6 is 2. So that's our estimate, 200,000. Now we actually have to subtract. So we start with our ones place. We can't take 9 away from 2, so we have to borrow from our neighbor. Our 3 becomes a 2, and our 1s becomes a 12. Now we can subtract 12 minus 9, and that is 3. Now we move on. We can't take 3 away from 2, so again, we have to borrow from our neighbor. Our 6 becomes a 5, and that 2 becomes a 12, and now I can subtract, and that's 9. Notice how I'm crossing out the neighbor first and reducing that before I'm adding over to its place next to it. You can't go ahead and borrow something from somebody without actually borrowing it, but add something to yourself. That doesn't work. So you have to borrow it first. 5 minus 3 is 2. 7 minus 2 is 5. 0 minus 9, I can't do that, so I have to go to my 8 and borrow. That becomes a 7, and my 0 becomes a 10. 10 minus 9 is 1. 7 minus 5 is 2. Now, notice I didn't go through and cross everything out. I have to look directly to see if my direct neighbor I can borrow from. If I can borrow from my neighbor, then I do it. I don't have to move all the way around. All right, I look at my estimate and I look at my actual difference or answer to a subtraction problem, and I see that they're pretty similar. So I probably rounded correctly, and I probably did my work correctly. I can always check with addition, though. So I could take my 215,293, and I could add 592,339, and I want to see if that gives me my bigger number of 807,632. Let's see. And 3 plus 9 is 12. Put my 2. Carry my 1. 9 plus 1 is 10. Plus 3 more is 13. Carry my 1. 2 plus 1 is 3. Plus 3 more is 6. 5 plus 2 is 7. 1 plus 9 is 10. And now I have 8. Let's look. 807,632. Yep, that is the same. You can always check with addition. Last but not least is everybody's favorite word problems. Now with word problems, we really have to figure out what they're asking us for. In this case, we'll read it through and we try and identify what they're asking. So the attendance of the first game at the football season was 93,584. The attendance for the second game was 104,227. First game, second game. Okay? How many more? How many more? Now, we're not really supposed to look at keywords so much, but this is a great keyword for us to look at. Usually when they say how many more, they want us to subtract. So how many more people attended the second game than the first game? So here is my second game. Here is my first game. That's the 1. That's the 2. So we want to know how many more people attended this game here than this game here. So we need to subtract. Now, some of you said, well, I can't subtract because the 93,584 is smaller than the 104,227. You're right, it is, but it's asking us to subtract the second game from the first game. Remember, a bigger number always has to go on top. So we have 104,227 minus 93,584. Okay, and I am subtracting, so I need my subtraction sign. 7 minus 4 is 3. 2 minus 8, I can't do that. I need to borrow from my neighbor. My 2 becomes a 1, and my other 2 becomes a 12. 12 minus 8 is 4. 1 minus 5, can't do that. You gotta come over here and borrow from my neighbor. That becomes a 3, and that becomes an 11. 11 minus 5 is 6. 3 minus 3 is 0. 0 minus 9, can't do that. 10 minus 9 is 1. So, how many more people attended the second game than the first game? 10,643 more people. Okay, let's take a look at the last problem. Abby and Lee sold raffle tickets to raise money for a new playground. Abby sold 1,052 tickets. Lee sold 379 more tickets than Abby. How many tickets did Lee sell? So here we have Abby. There's Abby. And Abby sold 1,052 tickets. Then we have Lee down here. Lee sold 1,052 tickets, and then he sold 379 more than Abby, which means he sold that many and some more. He sold more. In order to figure out how many tickets Lee sold, we need to add. So we have 1,052 plus 379. Because I need to figure out how many he sold in all. I'm going to add these two together. 2 plus 9 is 11. I carry my 1. 6 plus 7 is 13. I carry my 1. 1 plus 3 is 4. and then my 1 comes all the way down. So how many tickets did Lee sell? Lee sold 1,431 tickets. Now, if you're stuck on any of these skills, there's plenty of practice that you can do. You can go to my website and you can look at student resources, and there are websites there that you can look at with different resources if you're struggling with a certain skill. If you're struggling with subtracting, or if you're struggling with rounding, or adding, or word problems, there are a whole bunch of different activities that you can do to practice. You can also just Google search things and see if you can find some things with mom and dad that can help you practice these skills. Biggest thing is rounding. When they give you a number, make sure that you write that number down. Let's say they ask you for, they give you a number like this, 903,721. And in the problem, it uses words and it asks you to round to the thousands place. Make sure you underline the thousands place. Okay, make sure you're doing those things that will help you be successful. Don't just say, well, I'm going to look at this and I'm going to just do it. Write it down and underline those digits. That'll help you be successful. When we work this out, we can then visualize, okay, I have to look at its neighbor, and that's a 7, so my 3 is going to increase by 1, so this is going to turn into this number when I round. Okay, use those skills we talked about in class. Review your work, and I will see you in the morning for your test.